Olá, Tutaméia está ao vivo, como sempre, trazendo para você um personagem, uma figura que nos ajude a compreender melhor o mundo em que vivemos, para que a gente possa atuar melhor, trabalhar melhor, ainda mais nesses momentos aí tão dramáticos de crise de saúde, de crise econômica. Ficamos aqui na nossa quarentena tutaméica, a Eleonora,
o Rodolfo,
e do outro lado da telinha,
olha só
quem está conosco. Ninguém menos do que Noam Chomsky, reputado como um dos mais importantes, se não o mais importante intelectual de nossa era, que vai conversar com a gente aqui no Tutaméia. A Leonora até vai falar um pouquinho mais dele antes, a gente, só para lembrar que essa entrevista com ele foi gravada, nós conversamos com ele, começamos a entrevista às 5 da tarde, ou seja, um pouco mais de 1h30, gravamos essa entrevista e que ela agora vai ser transmitida para você e você vai poder encontrá-la também no nosso canal de vídeo, o Tutaméia TV. Todo o nosso trabalho está ancorado no nosso site tutameia.jor.br. Antes de a gente começar aí a apresentar um pouco mais a entrevista com o Chomsky, fale um pouco mais desse linguista, pensador dos povos, pensador da democracia.
Então, o Noam Chomsky acho que realmente é um maior intelectual que está em atividade, brilhou no século XX, continua brilhando no século XXI, né? É uma pessoa, um linguista, né? Ele começou estudando as palavras, a língua, tem estudos exemplares sobre isso, sobre a carga, né, que as palavras carregam. E ele sempre foi um ativista, um filósofo, um ativista político muito importante, né? Guerra do Vietnã, né? Foi muito presente em denunciar as atrocidades do governo americano, né? Sempre muito perseguido pelo governo americano, atacado, e ele tem uma trajetória muito crítica, né? Sempre colocando o dedo na ferida de tudo. Tem vários livros publicados no Brasil, ele esteve aqui no Tutaméia em 2018, e hoje a gente falou com ele 1h e pouco, né?
Uma hora e meia, tem 1h30 entrevista.
1h30 entrevista, a gente acabou de fazer e resolveu já transmitir para vocês, a gente gravou e vamos transmitindo aqui, a entrevista está em inglês. Ele fala da pandemia.
Só um pouquinho, antes, eu queria ressaltar aí esse aspecto que, de certa forma, é inusitado, considerando o mundo da intelectualidade, ou de uma grande parte da intelectualidade, que é esse aspecto de ativista, de militante, de cara que vai para a rua. Quando a Leonora falou da atuação dele nas campanhas pela paz durante o período da Guerra do Vietnã, quer dizer, ele estava na rua, ele estava nas manifestações, ele estava quebrando pau em defesa da paz, né, em defesa da democracia. Nestes anos que vivemos, né, em que em vários países do mundo a democracia é ameaçada, aqui no Brasil mesmo vem sendo golpeada de forma tão terrível desde 2006, o Noam Chomsky tem estado na liderança desses manifestos, desses atos públicos, participou de vários eventos aqui no Brasil e no resto do mundo, sempre em defesa da democracia. Então, ele é um pensador, um formulador, como a Leonora falou, e é o cara que está lá também nas barricadas. Eu acho que essa característica só acrescenta valor, qualidade ao pensamento que ele traz. Mas a nossa entrevista, a Leonora estava falando, começou perguntando para ele sobre a questão da pandemia, como é que ele está, né?
Ele está em Tucson, no Arizona, né, com a sua mulher, em casa, evidentemente, e ele falou muito do Trump, falou muito do Bolsonaro, falou de como o capitalismo está reagindo nessa crise, falou do balanço das potências, ele falou de tanta coisa, né, Rodolfo?
Começou contando que ele tá se sentindo, pelo menos na casa dele, em segurança, né? Porque está lá no meio do deserto, ele estava na casa dele em Tucson, no Arizona, né? E sobre a ação dos governos, especialmente do governo Trump, ele manifestou muita tristeza, muito desencanto, raiva até, disse que o Trump está atuando para aumentar o número de mortes, né, para aumentar a contagem de cadáveres. Né? Esse é o resultado da atuação do Trump. E também, ainda nessa questão da pandemia, de como as forças políticas e econômicas estão se movimentando nesse momento, quando muitos intelectuais, observadores políticos, econômicos falam de que o mundo pode sair melhor, pode ter um aprendizado de liberdade, de democracia, de empatia, né, e solidariedade, ele apontou o seguinte, que a extrema-direita, que a direita, que os prósperos, os poderosos do mundo, né, as forças do poder, já estão se movimentando no sentido de que o mundo, ao sair, quando e se sairmos dessa pandemia, ele esteja mais próximo do mundo que era antes da pandemia, quer dizer, das estruturas que fossem mantidas, as estruturas de dominação, apesar de todos esses exemplos que vão se enfileirando aí de forma evidente, né, de como o neoliberalismo fracassa em responder aos problemas da humanidade e aos problemas das próprias economias neoliberais, né? Então, acho que é um ponto interessante aí desse início da conversa dele, né? Que quer mais aposentar.
Ele fala muito da destruição que Trump e Bolsonaro estão fazendo, tanto nos Estados Unidos como no Brasil. Ele compara muito, né, a atuação dos dois, os discursos, as semelhanças entre os discursos, né, de primeiro negar a pandemia, negar o vírus e depois jogar a responsabilidade, né, dos cuidados da população, pelos cuidados da população aos governadores, meio se eximindo, né, e a gente está tentando aqui fazer um resumo meio rápido, mas cada resposta é uma aula, né?
Isso,
é bem aprofundado e tal.
Cada resposta vai buscar exemplos na história, discute muito como era o mundo na Primeira Guerra, o mundo pós-Primeira Guerra. Eu acho que foi uma etapa da humanidade que ele discutiu bastante para buscar lições aplicáveis hoje, ou exemplos de comportamentos que hoje podem estar se repetindo, enfim, então ele buscou isso nesse período. E também, claro, na Segunda Guerra e no pós-Segunda Guerra, também foram momentos da história lembrados aí pelo Noam Chomsky nessa entrevista.
Ele lembra que nos anos 30 a humanidade se defrontou com saídas, né, para aquela crise. De um lado, a saída pelo estado do bem-estar social, né, e de outro lado, o nazismo, o fascismo. A humanidade se confrontou com esses dois caminhos, né, houve uma guerra, né, em torno disso, e ele, de alguma maneira, traz essa comparação hoje. Quer dizer, a história não está dada, né? Ele sempre reforça isso, né? Que tem saída, que cabe aos combatentes lutar, que a coisa não está definida, que é preciso achar soluções e que as soluções existem. Né?
Isso. Agora, apesar de crer nisso, não se pode cair no otimismo.
Claro, não.
Aliás, ele apontou um trabalho de cientistas que estão lá mexendo no tal do relógio do fim do mundo, né? De quanto o mundo está se aproximando da destruição final, da hecatombe, e lembrou que os cientistas estão vendo esse relógio se acelerar, né? Porque havia dois grandes fatores que levavam o mundo, a humanidade, a se aproximar da hecatombe. Os dois grandes fatores é a questão da possibilidade da guerra nuclear e as mudanças climáticas, né, que são forças que podem... E agora, acelerando o relógio do fim do mundo, os cientistas apontam o terceiro fator, que é a destruição das democracias que vem ocorrendo aí nas últimas décadas em cada um dos lugares do planeta. Então ele também comentou sobre isso e comentou então quer dizer, o oposto também é verdadeiro. A defesa da democracia é o caminho para a defesa da humanidade, que é isso que ele aponta. Agora, bueno, acho que a gente temos nós dois aqui que colocar o Chomsky para falar, né? O povo aqui está... Então, pessoal, vamos colocar o Chomsky para falar. De novo, lembrando que isso aí fica disponível para vocês aí no nosso canal de vídeo, o Tutaméia TV. Vá lá, se inscreva. A gente teve a satisfação de chegar aí a 1/30 de 1 milhão de subscritores do canal, né? De inscritos no canal. Então, vá lá, se inscreva, convide seus amigos para se inscrever e clique na sinetinha para receber avisos de novos sinais. A gente também tem no Facebook um grupo chamado Amigos do Tutaméia. É legal estar lá também, o pessoal discute e a gente também põe sempre as novidades aí. Então isso, sem mais delongas. Mais um aviso, quem quiser, algumas pessoas estão falando, não entendo inglês. Quem for bom aí no inglês e puder colaborar, quiser botar nos comentários, de repente, destacar algumas das ideias dele, a gente vai depois fazer uma reportagem sobre essa entrevista. Essa reportagem vai ficar disponível no nosso site, tutameia.jor.br. Mas nós já tivemos em outras entrevistas em inglês comentadores que ficavam botando nos comentários destaques aí. Isso aí ajuda sempre quem está acompanhando, ou quem tem mais dificuldade em inglês, e mesmo quem está nos comentando para aumentar o debate aí entre os internautas que acompanham o Tutaméia.
Então, vai lá. Noam Chomsky, ao Tutaméia, acabou de acontecer, a gente está botando aqui tudo para você ver. Vamos lá.
So, very nice to see you. We want to begin asking you how are you doing? How you are doing with this period so absurd in a way?
Well, we're okay. It's pretty easy for us. We live out in the desert, so a lot of space, no people around. It's easy to be isolated. Even have enough space to let our dogs run around.
And how do you see the situation in the big picture? What do you think? What are going to see? What's the kind of the crisis of this crisis is big as 29? How do you see the situation in a whole?
Well, the situation's quite serious. It differs in different countries. The East Asian countries who paid attention to the information that China was providing acted very quickly, used test and trace measures, were able to contain it, and they're in reasonably good shape. But of course, they're not isolated from the world, so they'll be affected by what happens elsewhere. And so that's by no means over for them, but it's at least somewhat under control and be able to revive the economies. Europe wasted some time. They didn't pay much attention to the information that was coming out of China, but most of them finally pretty much got their acts together. There are a couple of countries that are simply where the leadership is insisting on destroying the countries. One of them is Brazil, the other one's the United States. So the United States is now, because of the way the show in Washington ran it, is now this epicenter of the crisis globally, many more deaths than any other country, rising. And Trump is now acting to increase the death toll. I could go into the details. Brazil, it's just indescribable. I mean, well, I don't have to tell you about it because you know more than I, but it's as if it's in another planet. And of course, it'll almost certainly get much worse. Fortunately, Brazil does have it does have a very good medical system, even if the new health director probably wants to dismantle it. It has research institutions like the Osvaldo Cruz Institution, which are in the forefront internationally of understanding what's happening, what to do about it. I think we can expect with some confidence that Bolsonaro will probably defund it. It's doing too much good for the general population. That's not the kind of thing. But apart from a few outliers like the United States and Brazil, the world is slowly managing to deal with it. It'll be a serious crisis. It'll be very costly. What kind of world comes out of it is to be determined now. Some are working on it. The business world, the right wing, is working quite hard to ensure that the system that emerges will be very much like the one that caused this, except harsher, more brutal, more profit, and so on. Just a harsher version of the neoliberal assault, which is what lies behind the crisis. Others have to try to overcome that, and can, but that's a conflict that's taking place right now and will become prominent as the virus recedes in the countries where it does. Other countries, it's going to continue to rage.
How do you think that the actions of Mr. Trump can be explained? Because even that governments that were in denial in Europe, like the UK government, they changed positions. And in the States, Trump seems to be, like you said, working in favor of the crisis, or working in favor of the pandemic.
Why did the crisis occur?
That.
Well, if we want to stop the next pandemic, which is right down the road, these are going to keep coming, each one more severe than the last because of the effect of global warming and so on. And scientists know very well what it is and how to deal with it. We might, unless we look at the roots of the current crisis and try to overcome them, it's going to be worse in the future. The scientists today know that they could be working on potential vaccines for the crisis that's going to come. And they also knew that in 2003, right after the SARS epidemic. It was pretty evident to the scientific community that another pandemic, probably another coronavirus pandemic, will be coming down the road, and they could have prepared for it. But of course, just to know what's likely to happen is not enough. Somebody has to pick up the ball and run with it, do something. Well, who can do it? The big drug companies have plenty of resources that they can do it, but they can't because of something called capitalism. There's no profit in it. Okay, so there's much more profit in doing something that'll work tomorrow than in preparing for a massive crisis that's going to be catastrophic. So we begin with a fundamental failure of capitalism. It's built into the system. Now, it can be avoided by a kind of regulated capitalism in which the savagery of capitalism is limited and mitigated by government control. That's, in fact, the way most of the world functioned from the Depression up until the 1980s, when Reagan and Thatcher inaugurated the new neoliberal programs. And you recall Reagan's inauguration speech: government is the problem, not the solution. Thatcher, there's no society, just individuals thrown into the market. it's had a devastating effect all over the world. But one of the effects is that in this case, the government couldn't step in to fulfill the gap that's left by the unwillingness, of course, of the drug company to do anything following market signals. When I was a kid, polio was a terrifying threat. I can remember it very well. Well, it was ended by a vaccine developed under government programs, no patents. When John Salk was asked whether he wanted a patent, he said, that's like patenting the sun. None of that, it's for everyone. That could have been done starting in 2003, but the government is hampered by the neoliberal plague, the doctrine that says, no, everything has to be transferred to the hands of private, unaccountable institutions. The crucial part of neoliberalism is we must destroy all democracy. The government has a flaw. It can be influenced by people. We don't want that. If decisions are in the hands of private power, they're unaccountable to the public, so everything's wonderful. They're tyrannies, but that's okay. Neoliberals don't mind tyranny as long as it's in the right hands. So the government's the second blow, neoliberalism, which blocked any reaction. And it's more than that. Neoliberalism means that things have to be run by a business model for efficiency. So hospitals can't have an extra bed because that would be inefficient. Plenty of people, I'm one in fact, can testify as to how this works in normal times. Even at the best hospitals in the world, it's pretty harmful. But if anything goes wrong, everything collapses. So if you're running an automobile manufacturer and you use just-on-time business models, something goes wrong, okay, assembly line doesn't work for a couple of hours, and you go back. You can't do that with the health system. So if you undermine and destroy the health system, make it very efficient by neoliberal principles, you're asking for catastrophe. And then comes the question of individual leaderships, how individual governments work. These other things are background for everyone under the neoliberal form of capitalist savagery. But then you come to individual governments. Take a look at what happened. Trump's been in office for 4 years. Through these 4 years, he's steadily defunded the health-related aspects of the government. Center for Disease Control, others. The US, in fact, had programs where US scientists were working in China along with their Chinese colleagues to try to prepare for things like this. And Trump canceled them. You know, it's money. It's just people's lives are at stake, not money for private power. So that's defunded. Hospitals are defunded. Healthcare system begins to collapse. But the United States is not alone in this. That's true in Europe too, wherever the neoliberalism had its lethal grip, and these models were followed in Europe, exacerbated by austerity programs. Nevertheless, some countries did pay attention to what was happening, and it wasn't a secret. It's now conventional to blame China. Let's blame somebody else for our crimes. It's normal. But if you take a look at the facts, the story's a little different. China informed the World Health Organization on December 31st that they were having an uprise in pneumonia-like symptoms with unknown etiology. A week later, Chinese scientists had figured it out very fast. They had identified it as a coronavirus. They had identified the genome. They provided all relevant information to virologists all throughout the world and to the World Health Organization. Well, some countries paid attention. Taiwan, South Korea, Singapore, New Zealand, a couple of others. They acted appropriately. It's not perfect, but they now have the situation pretty much under control. Europe didn't pay much attention to these Asians. What do they know? So they got into trouble. But again, they mostly have it in hand. For the United States, if you want to see what the Trump administration was doing, first of all, they were denying it. They were being bombarded by U.S. intelligence agencies, top U.S. health specialists who said, look, this is serious, we have to do something. Trump's only concern was to keep the stock market high. That will increase his electability. So he said, oh, it's just a cold, just flu. Bolsonaro is kind of the clown who's following him. Meanwhile, people are dying, pandemic's growing, steps aren't being taken. In mid-February, February 10th, the pandemic is raging. Trump comes out with his budget for the next year. It's worth taking a look at. Continue to defund the Center for Disease Control and other health-related parts of the government. In fact, defund anything that is of any assistance to mere human beings, but increase funding for subsidies to fossil fuel companies who are working to destroy the prospects for organized human life on Earth. So we therefore have to increase government funding for them. And of course, for the military, which is already out of sight. And obviously for his famous wall to keep the rapists and murderers from Mexico from coming to commit genocide against the white population. So that's the budget in the middle of the pandemic. Finally, by March, something broke through at the White House. I don't know what. And all of a sudden, the U.S. started to do something. And of course, it was accompanied by Trump's announcing that he was the first person in the world to know that it was a pandemic because he's so brilliant. And then this gets echoed on Fox News the next day saying the president is the greatest genius in human history. He knew it was a pandemic. And then we move on from there. And it's very interesting to see what's happening right at this moment. Trump has figured out that when he's tried every way to cover up for the crimes that he's committed. So blame China, blame the World Health Organization. That's getting kind of thin. So his next move, which is brilliant, is to tell the governors of the state, it's your problem. We can't help you. Federal government can't do anything. Okay. Mitch McConnell, the Senate leader, his accomplice, just yesterday told the states that we can't give you any money. Declare bankruptcy if you want. Okay. So it's all your problem. We can't help. We happen to have all the resources, but we can't help you. So if anything goes wrong, you can blame it on the states. If something by accident happens to work, Trump can say, look what a genius I am, it worked. Fox News will repeat it the next day. It's not only Americans that the Trump administration is working to kill, it's worldwide. And people don't talk about it much. But what happens when you defund the World Health Organization? Take funds away from the World Health Organization and take a look at Africa. The World Health Organization is the institution that's working to save Africans from dread diseases, cholera, diarrhea, miscarriages, all kinds of problems. So what Trump is saying is, we'll kill as many of you as we like if it can improve my election chances. And there's not a word of criticism about this. You want to do that? Okay, who are they? Just a bunch of black people. I mean, that's the world. You don't even hear criticism of this in Europe. You know, the Godfather did it, so okay, that's the world. And this is all over the place. I mean, you probably recall that about a year ago, Trump decided that the Palestinian Authority wasn't treating him nicely. He was offended. So he canceled all U.S. aid to hospitals, health services, Gaza, where it can barely be livable, but there's no criticism of that. If the Godfather wants to kill a lot of people who aren't nice to him, it's his right, you know. That's the world we're living in. In fact, if you look further, it's pretty remarkable. It takes a Europe. There's supposed to be something called a European Union. Remember that word people used to use, union. Germany's rich country, richest country in Europe, doing pretty well, managed to control things. Go a couple of miles south of the border, northern Italy, center of a pandemic. Are they getting any help from Germany? No, they are getting help from Cuba, as usual, the one internationalist country in the world. So they're getting help from Cuban doctors who are supported by China, which is exporting, first of all, sending doctors, but also exporting material that's needed, masks, ventilators, and so on. So fortunately, Cuba and China are there to overcome the fact that the rich countries in Europe don't want to help their poor neighbors. That's also the world we're living in. It's, and you can see it every minute. Today, yesterday, Trump announced that if U.S. warships in the Gulf are being harassed by Iranian boats, then shoot them out of the water and destroy them. Good, it's our right. Is there a background for this? I mean, why are Iranian boats doing anything? Did you ever hear of the U.S. pulling out of the treaty to deal with the nuclear weapons? U.S. pulled out, wants to increase the tensions and threats of war in the Middle East. Europe doesn't like it, but they're too intimidated by the United States to do anything. They could, but you have to be willing to stand up to the bully in the White House. Europe can't do that. They can make a few timid statements, but they can't do it. So yes, then you get increasing tensions. Now we can praise Trump for not going to war. Okay. I mean, or just take what happened yesterday. The Israeli government announced that it's going to annex parts of the West Bank. Okay. Europe came out with statements saying, not a nice idea, violates international law, you shouldn't do it. Mike Pompeo, Secretary of State, said, it's an Israeli issue, it's not up to us. Okay, that's the law. Okay, the world is very much like the mafia, where the Godfather happens to be a sadistic megalomaniac, and everybody else kowtows, bow to him, or else try to follow his path like Bolsonaro, either walk in his footsteps or bow to him. Fortunately, there's some who don't do it, like Cuba.
It's remarkable how similar the phrases and actions of Bolsonaro and how similar are the phrases and actions of Trump and Bolsonaro. Even to the very phrase, like Trump, Bolsonaro said that this was a small flu, a gripezinha. And like Trump, Bolsonaro said that the governors and mayors of the cities would have to take action and take responsibility for what happened in the country. So have you been watching what Bolsonaro is doing in Brazil, and what are your opinions about it?
You remember Karl Marx's famous comment about history repeating tragedy as farce. Trump is the tragedy, Bolsonaro is the farce. Following the master's footsteps, but making a total idiot of himself while he's doing it. It's kind of amazing what happened in Brazil. Just take a look at this century. The first 15 years of this century, Brazil was one of the most respected countries in the world. The leader in world affairs, Lula and Celso Amorim were regarded as some of the leading statesmen in the world. Brazil was a voice for the global South. It was enormous praise for its internal developments, even from the international financial institutions. The World Bank in 2016 had a review of the Brazilian economy. They said we've just gone through what they called the golden decade, unique in Brazil's history. Huge number of people lifted from poverty, inclusiveness, bringing marginalized part of the population, which in fact is pretty near the majority, into the mainstream, positive programs going. Commodity prices fell. There was a problem, but the bank said these can be handled by pursuing the right policies. There's no deep problem. Take a look now. Brazil is one of the most ridiculed countries in the world. It's dismissed as a joke. The policies it's pursuing are grotesque and designed to make it worse. Take the economic czar, Paulo Guedes, privatize everything. Okay, make sure we sell the country out to foreign investors and the super rich, and there's nothing left for the people. That's privatize everything. He hails the Pinochet regime. He was in Chile during those years working. It's a great wonder, huge economic triumph. He doesn't bother telling you what happened. And what happened is that his neoliberal saints, who had the perfect opportunity, first of all, notice they had the perfect opportunity to apply their theories. There couldn't be any protest, because if anybody protests, he goes to the torture chambers. So they're quiet. You get money was pouring in from international investors and the international financial institutions to try to make it work. They try to kill the Allende government. Now they're pouring in monies. The neoliberal heroes were smart enough not to touch the main source of Chilean wealth, a highly efficient nationalized copper company, Codelco, nationalized, very efficient, main source of Chile's income. So they forgot their principles long enough to allow this to remain. They had every imaginable advantage. Within 5 years, they had totally crashed the economy. The economy was in total collapse. In fact, the state had more control over the economy because it had to take it over than it had under Allende. People used to call this the Chicago road to socialism. Finally, handed it back to the traditional guards who ran the economy. They've kind of pulled it out, mostly thanks to high copper prices and their ability to produce fruit for the U.S. market in the off-season, a couple of other things. Enormous inequality, pension system collapsing, privatized pension system, the schools collapsing, huge protests all over Chile right now. That's the great success that Guedes wants to bring to Brazil. Okay, he can succeed in making it worse. Better than I, Bolsonaro fired the right-wing health minister because he was talking some sense. So he's out. The new one who came in is, what he said so far is appalling. He may even want to privatize the Brazilian health system, turn it into a catastrophe like the United States. The only privatized for-profit system, an international scandal. Twice the costs of comparable countries, some of the worst outcomes, and totally unprepared for anything like what's happening now because of that's the way privatized for-profit systems work. They don't want to waste money to try to save people who might be in trouble if anything goes wrong. That's not the way you increase salaries for CEOs. So, okay, now a catastrophe. You take a look at what's happening in New York. These really heroic doctors and nurses are working day and night to try to contain a catastrophe. They have to work without equipment, with dangerous conditions, because the government was in the hands of neoliberal fanatics, people like the ones who were trying to turn Brazil into a disaster. That's what we see right in front of us. Nothing secret. It's all right there. The question is how you react.
And how do you react?
Yes, how do you react to this?
Well, several ways. First of all, we should remember that in class war, one of the sides is relentless. They never stop for a second. The business world is constantly fighting a relentless class war, and they're doing it right now. They're trying to create the conditions for the post-crisis system and make sure it's an expansion of the neoliberal plague, which was very good to them. Of course, they made huge profits, even harsher than before, with more controls of the population. And bear in mind that that's perfectly consistent with neoliberalism. Neoliberalism had a lot of talk about liberty and so on, but the neoliberals were always strongly in favor of strong state intervention and state violence to ensure that their doctrines could be applied. The Pinochet dictatorship was an obvious case. Friedrich Hayek, Milton Friedman, all the gurus flocked down there. They said it was marvelous, best thing they ever saw. Hayek said there's more liberty under Pinochet than there was under the preceding regime. It's perfect. But forget those guys in the torture chambers or being dropped out of airplanes, and we don't care about them. Proper economic policies were followed. This goes back to the 1920s. Neoliberalism has its roots in Austria in the post-World War, First World War period. The Ludwig von Mises seminar gathered them all together. The Austrian proto-fascist government in 1928 smashed the labor unions violently, murdering lots of people, and crushed Australian social democracy. Von Mises couldn't contain his euphoria. He thought this was wonderful. He was writing that fascism is going to go down in history as having saved human civilization. In fact, he joined the proto-fascist government. And of course, what they were doing was fine. They were protecting what he calls sound economics. We could talk about what that means. But if you want to kill a lot of people and institute fascism, that's fine, as long as you do that. That's a lesson for today. The neoliberals who are trying to create the economy, the society of the future, will be perfectly happy with arbitrary state violence, as long as it achieves the end of maximizing the wealth and power of private wealth, private corporations, stagnation for everyone else, all with nice words about liberty and freedom. Just what we've seen for the last 40 years to make it worse. But there are other forces. There are popular forces who are opposing this all over. Some of them are just kind of self-help groups that have emerged, like in Brazil. I mean, there's communities in Brazil. I mean, again, I feel funny telling you about it because you know much more about it than I do. But just communities where just people are starting to help each other, help bring food to the elderly, mutual aid, and so on. The most spectacular case that I know is the favelas. The government isn't doing anything for them. The crime gangs stepped in to try to do something, to impose help whatever way you can in those miserable conditions. Things like this are happening everywhere. As I mentioned, the doctors and nurses are just almost indescribable in the heroism and courage that they're showing. There are major research institutions like Osvaldo Cruz, which are in the forefront of working to try to deal with this. And there are plans for going forward, even on an international scale. This coming November, there'll be the founding meeting of what they're calling a Progressive International. It was initiated by Bernie Sanders in the United States and Yanis Varoufakis in Europe. Varoufakis is the center of the DM25 movement, Europe-wide movement, which is trying to overcome the deep flaws of the European Union while preserving the parts of it that are good. Very sound policies, well adapted to the current period. They're trying to bring in the global south and to form an international union which will combat the reactionary international, which is being formed in Washington right before our eyes. It's very hard to find a geostrategic planning in the chaos of the Trump administration. But there is one thing that stands out. How much Trump knows about it, I don't know, but it's being clearly developed. An alliance of the most reactionary states in the world, headed by the White House, including Bolsonaro's Brazil, Sisi's dictatorship in Egypt, the worst dictatorship in Egypt's history, the Gulf dictatorships, harsh, brutal Islamist dictatorships, they join. Israel, right in the center of it, moving very far to the right. They're part of it. The Modis, India, Modi's trying to destroy the last shreds of Indian democracy to impose a Hindu ultranationalist rule, crush Kashmir and so on. So he's a perfect member of it, very close. Go to Europe, Hungary under Orban is turning into basically fascist state, so they're fine. Italy, you have people like Salvini, who wants to kill as many people from Africa crossing the Mediterranean as possible, fleeing from horrible conditions. Kind of ironic in Italy, because the first major genocides of the 20th century were carried out by Italy in Libya. Okay? Major genocides. Mussolini's Italy. Now Italy is in the forefront of killing people in the Mediterranean who are fleeing from Libya. A lot of things to think about. So Salvini would be perfect. Other right-wing ultranationalist characters around the world, they can all join in this reactionary international, progressive international. We'll try to counter them. Global organization. Well, you look at the level of state power, it seems like they're totally overmatched. State powers in the hands of the far right. But if you look at the level of people around the world, it's quite different. They have most of the populations with them. And if we can get to a stage where what people want matters, it could be a very different world. And you can work on that at every moment, just the way the right-wing business class is working on it for their interests at every moment. If you leave it to one side of class struggle, you know what's going to happen. But there are actually two sides. And the populations of the world don't have to be taken in by the right-wing sadistic demagogues. They can act in their own interests. That's a possibility. It's very much like the 1930s in this respect. It's my childhood, the memories are coming back. The Depression was very serious, and there were a few ways out. Some countries pick one way, some pick the other. One way out was fascism. The other way out was social democracy and New Deal liberalism. Well, finally came to a major war, which in fact was won by the Russians, but in the West, people don't want to talk about that. But the end of the war, at least for the West, left a general popular mood of radical democracy. We don't want that old system. We want to move in the way of what was called and what was radical democracy. The business world reacted very fast, including the US government and the British government, the Labour government instead. You take a look at when Britain and the United States entered Europe in the South, Italy first, Italy and Greece. The first thing they had to do was to crush the partisan anti-Nazi resistance and the incipient social forms they had developed, in particular in northern Italy. The partisans had developed a functioning worker-based economic system, worker-owned enterprises and so on. That had to be smashed brutally in Italy, viciously in Greece and Yugoslavia. Restore the old order. That was the important thing. Bring in fascist collaborators, put the economy back in traditional hands, and crush the radical democratic forces. That was the first task of Britain under the Labour government and the United States in the New Deal in those, actually the latter stages of the war, 1944, 45 and on. The rest of the world, it was an effort to kind of build a US-based international system, which was called an open system, meaning open to penetration by US-based capital and subject to US political control. Some ways beneficial outcomes, other ways pretty horrible ones, but those were the plans. But the choice in the 1930s was fascism or some kind of welfare state democracy. And countries went different ways, and in some ways it's similar now. There are other respects in which it's similar now. I'm old enough to remember the slogan of the German Communist Party handed down by Stalin. Everybody but us is a social fascist. We can't cooperate with them. Okay, so, and Hitler isn't that bad a guy. So we're not going to collaborate with the huge socialist parties to try to stop Hitler. In the last free election, 1932, the two major left parties, the Communist Party, the KPD, Socialist Party, the SPD, outnumbered the Nazis, but they didn't work together, partly because of the communist social fascist line, partly because the socialists didn't want to work with the communists. Well, we're seeing some of that today too. In the United States, for example, there's what's called a never Biden movement on the left, saying never Biden. Doesn't matter if Trump gets in, because Biden's a capitalist pig. So let's get Trump and see the world destroyed. I mean, I've been through this over and over again in my life. You may remember 1968 presidential election. Pretty militant left at the time. There was a choice between Hubert Humphrey, New Deal liberal, moving towards extricating the United States from Vietnam, and Richard Nixon. Don't have to tell you who he was. Humphrey's a capitalist pig. We can't vote for him. So let Nixon win. And a couple of million corpses in Indochina followed, but can't vote for a capitalist pig. That's what we're hearing now. History relives itself in very, very strange ways, unpleasant ones. But the fact of the matter is that another 4 years of Trump will be an unmitigated disaster. Climate change is the major issue, barely being discussed. but it's, we'll overcome the coronavirus somehow at great cost. We're not going to overcome the melting of the Arctic ice caps, Antarctic ice caps. That's going to go on. The other harmful effects, very harmful effects of global warming are going to go on. 4 more years. Trump is, of course, in the lead of trying to maximize the use of fossil fuels and to destroy the environment as quickly as possible. I should say the little clown who's following him in Brazil is doing the same thing. Current predictions, scientific articles, predict that in 15 years, 2035, the Amazon is likely to shift from being a net carbon sink, absorbing carbon from the atmosphere, to being a net carbon CO2 producer. It's a disaster for Brazil and for the entire world, but who cares? It's more important for agribusiness and mining to make some profit tomorrow. So let them destroy the Amazon, which pretty soon is going to turn into savanna, brush, finished. Once it hits a tipping point, it just disappears. But that's a little bit like the drug companies saying there's a catastrophe coming down the road, but we don't make profit from it. So you've had your friend Bolsonaro in Brazil. It's Trump, who's much more dangerous because US power is more dangerous. The rest of the world, almost all of it, is trying to do something or other. Trump and Bolsonaro are trying to destroy it. Okay, that's the main issue. There's another issue which almost nobody talks about, but is just as important. We're racing towards terminal nuclear war. The Trump administration has dismantled beginning to dismantle the last parts of the arms control regime, eliminated the Reagan-Gorbachev INF treaty, which was protected us somewhat from terminal war. The Open Skies Treaty, which is from Eisenhower. They're now trying to get this, announcing they're going to get rid of that. The New START Treaty, they're finding all kind of ways to evade it. It's interesting to look at the ways, no time for it. But Russia's pleading with the United States to renew it. Trump administration saying no. So there are people who are happy about this. The arms manufacturers are delighted. Great new contracts for developing new means to destroy everything. Maybe more contracts on the hopeless effort to defend against them. So it's just a bonanza. For the rest of it, it's a disaster. Anyone who's looked at the history of the nuclear period knows it's kind of a miracle we've gotten this far. So let's make it worse. There's other things. This is specific to the United States. The Trump administration is working overnight to stuff the judiciary at every level, Supreme Court down to the lower courts, with young far-right judges who will guarantee that for another generation, at least, that nothing can be done, nothing can be implemented that's in the least progressive. So no matter what the country wants, we'll be in the hands of Trump, McConnell, the ultra-rightists. That's happening. And it goes on. We can see what it means to the world. But that's what we're facing. So we have the same kind of choice there was in the early 30s. And rather similar forces pursuing their interests.
In the 30s, we have the beginning of the conditions of the Second World War. You think we are facing this kind of outcome, a war, a global war? And in what way this crisis can change the balance of power in the world?
I don't think a global war is very likely. In fact, it's a very safe prediction that there won't be a global war.
Because of the nuclear,
confidence that there won't be, for a very simple reason. if we're wrong, nobody's going to be around to care. So we're safe, you know. However, it's very likely, you know, every year the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, the main scientific journal, brings together scientists, political analysts to try to give an assessment of the global security situation. This is kind of symbolized in what they call the Doomsday Clock. There's a clock which has a minute hand a certain distance from midnight. And midnight means we're done, you know, goodbye, nice to have known you. It was started in 1947, right after the atom bombings, and it's oscillated over the years. And through the Trump years, it's been moved closer and closer to midnight every year. Last year, it reached the closest it had ever been. This year, it went beyond what it's ever been. They abandoned minutes and turned to seconds. It's now 100 seconds for midnight. And they gave 3 reasons. 3. They used to give 2. One reason is the threat of nuclear war. The other is the threat of global warming. Now they've added a 3rd, the deterioration of democracy. And that makes sense. If democracies collapse, as is happening in the United States, in Brazil, in Hungary, a couple of other places, there's no way to counter the first 2 problems. Okay. So that's their assessment, which I think is quite reasonable. So yes, there could be a terminal nuclear war. We're getting closer to it. Eliminating these treaties is, of course, gets us closer. The United States is not totally to blame for this. Others are too, but the West has a very high share of responsibility and also the power to do something about it. We have the power to do this. Of course, it's much easier, as is happening in Brazil now, to blame it on everything on China. You know, that's easy. Hitler could blame everything on the Jews. That was easy. But you can also try to look at things realistically, see what the problems are, and try to deal with them. We can do that. Every single problem I've mentioned has solutions in hand. Nuclear war, the solution's obvious. Reinstate the treaties, reduce nuclear weapons. In fact, if you really think about it, get out of the propaganda cocoon for a minute and start to think. There are major things that can be done, like take nuclear war. One of the real hotspots is the Middle East. Trump pulled out of the nuclear agreement. That considerably increases the threat of nuclear war in the Middle East. Is there a way? It's claimed that Iran's potential nuclear weapons are a threat. Fact of the matter, it's mostly a farce, but let's agree with it. Let's say Iranian nuclear weapons policies are a threat. Is there a way to deal with it? Stop to think for 1 minute. It's a very easy way to deal with it. Establish a nuclear weapons-free zone in the Middle East. Is that a problem? Certainly not with the Arab states. They've been pressuring for it for 25 years. And certainly not Iran. They're strongly in favor of it. So they said, great, let's do it. Not the G77, 130 countries, the former non-aligned countries, strongly in favor of it. Europe, more or less in support. They don't talk about it much. So practically the whole world's in favor of it. What's the problem? One state. It's called the United States. Every time this comes up, the U.S. in international conferences, the U.S. vetoes it. Last one was Obama, 2015. It's coming up again in next January, February. If Trump's elected, he'll veto it. Okay. Why does the United States veto a program which would end any conceivable Iranian nuclear threat? Again, this time it takes only 30 seconds to find the answer. The answer is Israel. If you have a nuclear weapons-free zone, Israel's vast nuclear weapons establishment will have to be inspected. The U.S. doesn't want that. In fact, the U.S. does not even officially concede that Israel has nuclear weapons.
Yeah.
And that's for a reason. If they concede that Israel has nuclear weapons, you have to cut off military and economic aid to Israel under U.S. law. Okay? So therefore, in order to protect Israel's system of weapons of mass destruction, we have to face the likely possible nuclear war, and turmoil and destruction in the Middle East. That's the way the world works. Okay? It's not very hard to decode. It's hidden. Nobody talks about it. It's not the kind of thing it's nice to talk about. But it's there, and it doesn't take the capacities of the quantum physicists to see it. It's right in front of everybody's eyes. As soon as you peel away the thin layer of propaganda that we all are submitted to if we accept it. And this is true in case after case. To deal with global warming, there are very careful studies, detailed studies that conclude very conclusively that in the United States, you could do this for a fraction of the cost of mobilizing for the Second World War. Okay? It's not a huge problem, but of course you have to agree to do it, not rush in the direction of maximizing the threat, as Trump is doing today. Okay? And as the never Bidenists on the left are helping, just like the social fascists of my childhood. Well, that's the world we live in. We can do something about it, but it's not going to be solved by itself. Every problem is, in principle, in hand, without utopian solutions, solutions even within the framework of existing institutions. I think those should be dismantled, but that's another story. In fact, there are many other things that can be done right now. So you just take a look at oil prices. They're very low. For recently, the oil companies have been pleading with people to take our oil. What does that mean? It means it would be quite easy for the government to take over the oil industry and then dismantle them. We don't want them. They're just destroying the world, so who wants them? So buy them up, pay off the owners that they don't deserve it, and then get rid of them. And let's move on to a sustainable world. That can be done. There's numerous other things. Take some of them are pretty amazing. Just this morning, for example, Mitch McConnell, Senate leader, who's the real evil genius behind this. He knows what he's doing. He's not a fool. Mitch McConnell this morning announced that the federal government, the stimulus that the federal government is using is not going to go to states. If states don't have enough money to pay police and firemen and school teachers and so on, that's their problem. But the way he put it is, we're not going to compensate the states for making bad decisions in the past. The bad decisions were to give pensions to working people. And we're not going to compensate the states for their bad decisions. That's with one hand. With the other hand, we're going to pay off the airline industries.
Yeah.
The exact amount that they've spent in the last years rewarding themselves and their executives with buybacks. That wasn't a bad decision. That was a good decision. So therefore, we're going to pay them for it. And that's what's called neoliberalism. Okay? It's all across the board. Every point you look, you see the same thing. That's called class war by savage, brutal class warriors. They know what they're doing. They're clever at it, and they can more or less get away with it as long as others keep quiet.
And so there is no way capitalism can change with this crisis. We are only going to see more capitalism, more inequality. What do you think? You can foresee some kind of change because of this crisis?
Things are pretty easy to deal with. So take stock buybacks, which is one of the ways in which the corporations enrich rich investors and management. Are they necessary? They were illegal until Reagan. It was illegal, and there weren't any, because the Treasury Department enforced the law, so you couldn't do it. But what about tax havens? There's tens of trillions of dollars in tax havens. Can that be stopped? Until Reagan, it was illegal. There weren't any. Treasury Department enforced it. Is it utopian to say, let's go back to the period before Reagan? I mean, that was by no means a paradise. It wasn't utopia. But is it impossible to imagine unraveling this sadistic program of the past 40 years and going back to what there was before? Of course, we can go way beyond that. But right now, if there was a government that represented the population in the United States instead of representing wealth and corporate power, when they give a stimulus, when they pay, if you decide to pay off the airlines and the banks and the other criminals who've been enriching themselves, you decide, okay, we'll pay them off. You can put conditionalities. You give money to some industry, you say, you have to commit yourself to have no buybacks, no tax havens, workers on the board of management, a living wage, a cap on bonuses, an end to subsidizing fossil fuel. Okay, a lot of conditionalities you can put in. Are they enforceable? Sure. They were enforced before Reagan. They can be enforced today. That would make a big difference without changing the institutions. Okay, I think they should be changed too. It's another story, but you can work for that while we deal with the current crises, including the huge crisis that's right behind the coronavirus, namely global warming. We can deal with it, but not if the world is in the hands of sociopaths, then we can't.
But do you think that people or the forces in the world who believe that and then try to change the system actually?
Try to. Didn't hear.
Can people be organized to change, to act and change the system? Because we have seen the unions and the social movements are very weak in many, as far as many decades. Do you see social forces capable to act, to change those things?
The social movements able to act under the dictatorship? Actually not. A little bit, but not. But then they started to act, and Brazil reached its golden decade. Can happen again. I mean, when Bolsonaro hints, not such a subtle hint, that you ought to dismantle Congress and establishment as dictator, and crowds mobilize, screeching for it. Other ones can be mobilizing to denounce it, not in a crowd, because they don't want to die from virus, but 2 meters apart, you can have a demonstration like that.
Yeah.
Okay, and it can be huge, and you can do all sorts of other things. So sure, there's constant ways of mobilizing, but you have to be willing to do it the way the workers' movement was able to do it in Brazil at the tail end of the dictatorship. It can be done.
And do you think, in the beginning you talk about China, do you see any change in balancing, in power balance in the world? Is the power of the United States in a way decreasing and the China is rising? What do you see in this global view?
Kind of a mixed story. I mean, China's rise from the overcoming of poverty in China in the last 20 years has been pretty spectacular. Actually, with all the faults of the Maoist era, the groundwork was laid then in rural development programs, rural health programs, lots of other things. I mean, there are things about China that you don't hear in the rush of the flood of propaganda. So, for example, compare, say, China and India to back in 1947, they were kind of similar powers. Between 1947 and 1979, when China moved in its new direction, China saved 100 million people as compared with India. It's not a small number. 100 million people were saved in China just by instituting health measures, development measures in the countryside. You don't hear much about that. And that's including the Chinese famine and everything else. Okay, China finally, by now there's been economic successes, rise from poverty in the midst of a harsh dictatorship with degrees of popular control, which were never reached in the most totalitarian states, and brutal treatment of the Uyghurs in Western China and much else. China has enormous internal problems that the West doesn't have. Demographic problems, ecological problems. Despite its rise in, people talk about the Chinese economy. You look at the economy per capita, it's not that great. If you look at other measures, like the UN has a Human Development Index, which takes many factors into consideration. China's ranked about 90th in the world, India around 120th, so on. The idea that China and India are going to take over the world is a little bit paranoid. A lot of internal problems, they're rising, and the U.S. is worried about it. A good part of U.S. policy, it's called the America First policy, is to try to prevent Chinese development. It's a very cruel policy. Let's prevent their development. They're developing too fast. Okay, it's not only cruel, it's suicidal. China is in the lead internationally in dealing with global warming. Their emissions record is terrible, but they're in the forefront. They produce the majority of solar panels, high quality solar panels. They're way in the lead. Same with wind turbines. Electrification is far above all other countries put together, electric cars and so on. Instead of trying to destroy it, we should be learning from it. We should be an interconnected, cooperative world where instead of harming other efforts to grow and develop, we should be learning from them. Same is true in, say, dealing with the pandemic. I mean, US and Chinese scientists were cooperating in China on working on these things. Stopped. Why? Trump pulled the US scientists out. Does that help us? I mean, we're following policies which, in order to harm others, also happen to be suicidal, but good for short-term profits, so who cares? But if you look at globally, US, what's called soft power, the way you look at it, the way people feel about a country, the US soft power is sharply declining. The US is probably the most feared and hated country in the world by now, thanks to Trump. A couple of years managed to destroy it, just as Bolsonaro succeeded in destroying Brazil's image in the world. It's possible to do that. But that's soft power. When the US says something, everybody has to agree. We see that over and over. We saw it yesterday. Israel announced that it's planning to take over, to annex parts of the occupied territories. The European Union came out with a statement saying, that's not a nice thing to do. You're violating international law. We're not going to like you if you do that. France made a statement. Germany made a statement. The United States made a statement. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo said, it's none of our business. It's an Israeli issue. They can do what they want. What prevails? The US saying, do whatever you want, or Europe saying, we're unhappy about it? Okay, that's an answer to the question where power lies in the world. Same with the dismantling of the Iran joint agreement on nuclear weapons, on nuclear development. The Trump administration decided we don't like it. Why? Because Obama did it. And anything Obama did, we have to do the opposite to show that we're great men. That's basically the reason. From the point of view of security or anything else, it's ludicrous, very harmful. Europe didn't like it. In fact, they hated it. Did they do anything about it? Made a few comments saying it's not nice. It goes ahead. Trump recently announced what they call the deal of the century in Israel-Palestine. The deal of the century, as everybody knows, was written by Benjamin Netanyahu and handed over to Trump's little baby-faced son-in-law, and he pronounced it. Suppose China had produced a proposal, or Germany, or France, or Russia, anybody. Nobody would have even laughed. This time, immediately, everywhere, Europe, Latin America, the United States, it becomes the plan. All the discussion is it going to work? Is it fair? Too much of this, but it's the plan because it was announced by the Godfather. Okay, you look at military power. The U.S. is just so overwhelming. I don't even have to talk about it. And no other country has 800 million bases all over the world, troops fighting everywhere, and so on. Now take a look at sanctions. Do you know any other country in the world can impose sanctions? The U.S. has a third of the world under sanctions. Everybody says, that's just normal, why not? And they're brutal, harmful sanctions, very harmful. The world hates them, but does it matter? To take the sanctions on Cuba, basically a blockade of Cuba, to try to prevent it from developing. They've been on for 60 years. Does the world like it? Take a look at the UN General Assembly. Every year it comes up at the UN. The vote against the sanctions is overwhelming. Last couple of years it's unanimous. Israel votes with the United States, of course. So Israel and the United States oppose it. Everyone else opposes the demand that it be ended. Everyone else calls for it. What happens? Is it ended? Does anybody even think of ending it? Take a look at economic power. Economists usually measure purchasing power, gross GDP. Those are measures, but they're not the only measures. There's another measure which is much more significant in a world that's globalized under capitalist framework. How much wealth, world's wealth, is owned by nation-based corporations? So take the United States. How much of the world's wealth is in the hands of US-based multinationals? 50%. Spectacular number. There's never been anything like that in history. You look at the separate categories, finance, manufacturing, retail. Almost every one, US corporations are in the lead, maybe second. Nobody else is even close. I mean, US soft power is declining, but actual power is very deeply rooted. Nobody else is close. People talk about trying to get off the dollar, which gives the US an enormous advantage. Let's talk about it, but it's not happening. Europe's not ready for it. China might try to push it, but not ready for it. So I think it's true that the US is seriously declining and of course is being severely harmed by Trump, just as Brazil is being severely harmed by Bolsonaro. But in the US case, the power is so enormous that it still remains overwhelmingly dominant.
Okay.
You said
You said
not only You go back to the late 19th century, the US was by far the richest country in the world, richer than other capitalist countries put together. It wasn't a major force in world politics then, it was second to Britain, but it was overwhelmingly wealthy. It has enormous advantages. I mean, can you think of another country where you can travel 3,000 miles and think you're in the same place? Enormous internal resources, homogeneous population. There's minorities, but they get assimilated. This just has tremendous advantages over everyone else. Actually, Brazil could be like this. You go back to the 1920s, the business world was predicting that Brazil would become what they called the Colossus of the South, the Colossus of the North. Well, for lots of internal reasons in Brazil, which we don't have to go through, that didn't happen. It was beginning to happen under the Lula government, but then it was beaten back by a right-wing elite coup, now debated again. But there's no other countries that have that kind of advantages.
You said that Trump is a tragedy for the world and for the United States. Nevertheless, he can be re-elected this year. Do you think this will happen, or have the Democrats strength to overcome him, to win the elections?
It's not at all clear, unfortunately. He might well win the election. If he can manage, notice that he's carrying out an amazing scam. He's got a group of adoring followers who, in fact, he's harming in every way he can think of. You take a look at the legislative programs. Almost every program is a giveaway to the extreme wealth, corporate power, harmful to his voting base, but they adore him. And he's a clever politician. He knows that you can keep them in line if you do two things. One, you announce loudly, I'm your savior, I love you, I'm the only person working for you. And on the other hand, you give them little gifts on the side. So about a quarter of the population in the United States is evangelical Christians. It's a large part of Trump's voting base. So what you do is say, I'm opposed to abortion. Actually, there isn't the slightest reason to believe it, but I'm opposed to abortion. So I'll appoint judges who will ban abortion. I'll allow your mega preachers and your preachers in the mega churches to get involved in politics in violation of the Constitution. So I'll let you have that. And I'll give you a couple more gifts like that. Meanwhile, I'll stab you in the back with my social and economic policies and lead the world to disaster. You take Trump's base, if you look at it, is mostly fairly affluent. They're not poor, no poor people, very few were, with all the talk, not much of a working class support, but a relatively affluent, mostly petty bourgeois population, small storekeepers and insurance salesmen, rural, Christian, traditional, white supremacists, and so on. So I'll give them things. I'll give them. They like guns. I'll give them guns. Anything that doesn't have any policy effects. Trump has turned this into an art form. The Republicans have been doing it for years because they have to. The Republicans are the party of great wealth and corporate power. You can't come to the voters and say, please vote for me, I want to smash you in the face. This doesn't work. So what they're forced to do is pretend to be in support of what a large part of the population wants on so-called cultural issues. And when I say pretend, I mean pretend. We know the history of this. It starts with Nixon. In the case of Nixon, the South was very racist and segregationist. The Democrats supported civil rights legislation. And Nixon realized we can get the Southern vote by being racists. So that's the so-called Southern strategy. We'll be racist, we'll get the Southern vote. Made a big difference. A couple of years later, Republican strategists realized that they can get a large part of the Northern vote if they pretend to be anti-abortion. Then they can get the Northern Catholic vote and the evangelical vote. So they switched on a dime. You look back earlier, they were all pro-choice. Reagan, when he was governor of California, passed the strongest legislation ever in support of women's rights to choose. But when this revelation came, all of them, Reagan, George H.W. Bush, who people believed had some principle, all the rest of them, quickly became advocates of ending abortion. We can get votes that way. Take a look at guns. It's a very interesting thing. In the United States, guns are a religion. Literally, people will fight to the death to have a garage full of assault rifles. Where did that, literally, I'm not joking. Where did that come from? We'll take a look at it. It came from the first great public relations campaign in history. In the late 19th century, after the Civil War, and when wars declined in Europe, the gun manufacturers lost their market. I mean, it was an agricultural country, so everybody had a gun, but it was an old-fashioned musket that you used to drive coyotes away. They didn't want the fancy stuff that the gun manufacturers were producing. So they had a brilliant idea. Let's invent a story about the Wild West, the thing we all saw in cowboy movies when we were kids. 10-year-olds old actually believed. You know, the sheriff fast on the draw, you know, all this is Wyatt Earp, Wild Bill Hickok, and all this stuff. They invented it. There was never anything like that. There was no Wild West. Cowboys were the dregs of the society, the guy who couldn't get a job, so he pushed cows around. It was, all of this was invented. A lot of people fell for it, like me. You know, when I was 10 years old, my friends, we'd play cowboys and that sort of thing. For a lot of the public, that became the thing. Then along comes the Supreme Court, most reactionary court in history, maybe modern history. There was a case in 2008 where the court reversed 100 years of precedent on the Second Amendment. You read the Second Amendment, it says, in order to maintain a well-ordered militia, the right to hold arms shall not be infringed. So the Supreme Court decided to cut out the first phrase and say the right to bear arms will not be infringed. And there was a very interesting decision written by Antonin Scalia, the great scholar, the leading originalist. We have to pay attention to what the founding fathers wanted. That's what we do. We don't care what happens since. You read his judgment. It's very interesting. It's very scholarly, you know, all kind of quotations from 17th century English law. Not one word about why the founders wanted people to have guns. Not one word. It's not a secret. First of all, the United States had no standing army, and the British were the great power then. So the British are coming. We don't have a standing army. We have to have militias, like the Minutemen. Well, that disappeared 2 centuries ago. Second reason, we're a slave-owning society. We got to keep the slaves under control. Virtually all the founders are slave owners. There were slave revolutions going on all over the Caribbean. So we need guns to keep the slaves under control. The main one is the British were keeping us from going over the Appalachian Mountains. They were keeping the colonists stuck in the East Coast. We don't want that. We want to invade and exterminate the Indian nations. And so we need guns. The British were preventing that. In fact, that was one of the main reasons for the Revolutionary War. Not just settlers, even great land speculators like George Washington. We don't want to be stopped by this. So we need guns. We have to go kill Indians, conquer their territory, exterminate them. Okay? Those are the reasons. See if you can find a word about them in Scalia's decision. No, it's not for us. That decision turned the Second Amendment into holy writ. If you did a poll among Americans today and asked them what's in the Constitution, and most of them would only know the Second Amendment. You might try it, but nobody knows anything else. It's just the second. It's been turned by amazing propaganda into a kind of holy writ, literally. People are willing to die for their right to maintain a bunch of assault rifles. Well, then the Republicans pick that up and say, we're for you. You can have a, you can carry your assault rifle into church if you want. We're for you. That's the way you keep a population under control. The other demagogues have done it in the wrong ways. Take Hitler. It's the Jews and the Bolsheviks. They're destroying civilization. We have to defend civilization from them. Take Stalin, counter-revolutionaries. We got to put you all in jail and kill you in the gulag. Trump has his own, and it goes back to the Republican Party generally, as they drifted way to the right. They basically had no alternative. And Trump has turned it into, as I said, a kind of an art form. Get off, I'm afraid of it.
So the last time you talked in 2018, you talk about hate. And you said that you saw so much hate in Brazil, much more hate in Brazil than in the United States. Now some people are talking about solidarity, that this crisis is bringing solidarity back. Do you think that's a change you can foresee between hate and solidarity, or?
I didn't entirely understand. Say it again.
You in 2018, you talked to us about hate, and you said that you hate. You said that you saw much more hate in Brazil than in the US. Now some people are talking about the growing of solidarity. Solidarity. The crisis bring people helping each other. What do you think about that, hate and solidarity? I think
it's kind of like the two forces we were talking about before. It's a kind of a reflection of class conflict. Mm-hmm. Brazilian, I'm not an expert on this. You know way more about it than I do. But the impression I have from a lot of travel around the world and spending time in Latin America is that Latin American elites are unusual in the class hatred. I mean, you hear things from Brazilian elites that I don't hear elsewhere, unless I go to places of, real white supremacist neo-Nazis, like condemning Lula because he doesn't speak perfect Portuguese, for example. He's just some kind of Indian or something that doesn't deserve to be here. These people have to be humble, and they're supposed to be grateful for what we give, and not climb beyond what they're supposed to be. You don't hear things like that in most countries. It's there's a level of, and it's shown up in policy. Why didn't Brazil become the Colossus of the South? Well, one reason is that Brazilian elites basically have no responsibility to the country. They don't have to pay taxes. They can buy a home in the Riviera. They can send their kids to Oxford or Harvard. But they have nothing to do with Brazil, except for their rich mansion and the servants they have. They don't have to help develop the country or anything. It's not their business. In fact, that's all over a lot of Latin America. It still remained a kind of feudal, in a way, almost pre-capitalist culture. We enrich ourselves, we take care of ourselves, but those other people are worthless. One of the reasons they hated Lula is he started to change that. What are these Indians doing in the universities? Why is this domestic servant saying, you have to pay me a wage, and so on? But there's nothing novel about that. It's just extreme in Brazil. So you go back to the First World War. Woodrow Wilson, leading liberal, and his Secretary of State, Robert Lansing, along with the West General, were appalled by the Bolshevik Revolution. Why? Because it was going to lead to the ignorant and stupid masses taking over the world. We can't have that. It would mean, as Wilson, the way Wilson put it himself, is he heard that with Negro soldiers coming back from Europe, Americans, you're hearing all sorts of things about we ought to have rights. There are even Negro laundresses who are saying we ought to be paid a decent wage. Now, we can't have that kind of thing. So we have to smash the Bolshevik Revolution before it starts. Okay. The attitudes are not unique to Brazil, but they're amplified. At least my impression is you hear a lot more of it among Latin American elites. And in fact, if you look at, you compare Brazil with East Asia. Why did East Asia develop and Latin America didn't? Latin America has enormous advantages that East Asia doesn't have. For one thing, no international threats. Secure, totally secure. East Asia certainly wasn't in the midst of all kind of wars. Resources. Latin America has them, East Asia doesn't. What happened? You look at East Asian development programs the last half century. They import capital goods. They target investment so it'll contribute to development. You look at Latin America, import luxury goods for the rich, export capital, sell commodities, don't try to develop. It's not 100%, I'm not saying that, but it's a substantial difference. And over time, it matters. Now, these are all things that could be changed. They don't have to be like that. They started to change, not enough. Lula could have done a lot more, I think, but they did start to change. I really have to get off. I have another interview.
Okay. Is a message. Your message to Brazil. No. A message to Brazilians.
Take your future into your own hands. Don't give it over to somebody else, or you're going to be in trouble.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye. Bye-bye.